The last thing for us to talk about in this chapter is for loops. So we've already discussed two different looping mechanisms, while loops and do while loops. A for loop is another type of loop that's again structured a little bit differently, or perhaps written a little bit differently. So let's go back to kind of our standard example, which is printing out a bunch of numbers from 1 to 20. So if I were to do it the old-fashioned way, right, the way we've seen before with the while loop, I would write something like this. I would set up my I variable, and I would set to the first thing I want to print out. Then I would have a while statement, and then inside I would have my condition, right? I less than 21, right? So I want to go up until 21, and that's how many things I'm going to print. And then inside of that, I would have my print statement, printing out that variable. Keep in mind again that I variable, right, as we've seen, is what's changing over time, right? That's going to be increasing. And it'll increase because of this line here, which is the I++. This is the incrementer, right? So every time this loop runs, it'll print out a different number. We'll bring up the terminal real quick, and then compile this, run it, and see what we get out. This is what we got last time, all the numbers from 1 to 20. But there is a second way we could write this same thing, and this will be with a for loop. So what I'll write instead of this, and let me actually comment out this code, right? I'm going to comment this out so that we can see what the old way was to do, and then what a for loop looks like. So instead of writing that stuff, I'm going to write the following. For int I equal 1, I less than 21, I++. Close that with a parenthesis, open a curly brace, add a closing one. And inside I'll write system.out.println of I. Let's go over to output. I'm going to clear it really fast so we can make sure that we're seeing the right thing. And I'll run this. And so again we see 1 to 20 being shown. So this is a little bit more compact than a while loop. All of our kind of our different parts, right, are when we create our variable, when we checked it, when we incremented it, all of those three things, instead of being spread out three different places, are all going to be on one line. They all get combined into this first line. So the format of this line is first I've written the word for, then I have an open parenthesis, and then I have my declaration, right, the variable that I've created that's going to be changing as this loop runs. So I have here my int I equal 1, right, whatever I need to set up. And this one over here, right, that's essentially our initial value, right, wherever this loop is going to start. And then my second part here, this is my conditional. This is what will be checked to determine if this loop should run or not. Over here where I've just copied it from the while loop, right, the condition originally was over here, in a for loop it ends up over here. And also pay attention here, I'm using semicolons to split up these different parts, right? So I had a semicolon after my variable declaration, and then I have a semicolon after my condition, right? So that's how we show that these things are different. We put a semicolon in between them. And it's just specific to the for loop. The last part in here is the incrementer, the I++, right? So that's the bit I had over here in my while loop. While over in a for loop, it's kind of built in over here, right? It's not its own line. And it will still end up working a little bit like this while loop. This I++, that's actually going to be executed over here, right? So I++ normally happens in a for loop over here. The conditional, the I less than 21, that will be checked at the very beginning, right? So that'll be checked before we run anything inside. So in that respect, it works more like the while than the do loop, because there's a chance that for the for loop, since we checked the condition before, the code inside doesn't actually run. So it's acting like a while loop. Overall, for loops, you probably will see them a lot more than while loops in code. The main kind of difference between them is that people typically use for loops when they know how far they want to go, right? How many elements they want to look at, right? How many times they want to loop, right? Here we know, oh, it's 21. When you have a fixed starting place, this is typically what you want to use. For the while loop, people will often use while loops when they're not really sure where they're going to end. For example, when they're using iterated, right? Maybe they're writing code that looks like this. Well, file has next, right? This is a case where I'm not really sure how long this thing is going to be looping versus for loop when I already know what's going on. To make sure we have the syntax down, we're going to go and try drawing a diamond again, which is what we did when playing with nested loops for while. So I'm going to get rid of the code up here. I'm going to start by adding a new variable. Final int max rows equal 10. My aim this time is to be able to easily resize that triangle. So I'm going to create a separate variable that stores the height of that triangle. And I'm just going to call that max rows here. The final bit over here tells Java this thing should not change, right? Max rows cannot change later in the program, right? This is its final value. Its final value is 10. And then over for my while loop, I'm going to rename I to be row. And then I'm going to change over here the condition, right? The condition that says how long I should loop. And I'm going to change this to be row less than or equal to max rows, right? So that'll control how many times this loop runs. Finish renaming that. Then we'll go in here and we'll kind of test this out halfway. I'm going to put in a spare print. We'll use that later. Over here, I'll just put in some temporary text. So I'll put in some stars. So right now we have a for loop that should run 10 times, right? It should run from 1 up to 10 inclusive, right? So it'll run 10 times. Let's compile this. Let's run it. Hopefully we get that rectangle. Okay, so we get a rectangle. And this is 10 by 4 stars. Now let's go ahead and expand this out, right? Remember our goal is to have a triangle. Let's start a second for loop inside. And here, create a new variable. And this time I'm going to call it star. And we'll go, well, star is less than or equal to row, right? I want, based on how many rows I've been through, right? That's how many stars I want to print out. And every time, right, I'm going to have to still have my incrementer here, stars plus plus. So this is kind of like we did with the while loop, right? There is this dependency here, right? The bigger the row is, right, the farther I've gotten, the more things I'll print out, right? The more stars I'll print. And inside I've changed this, so I'm just printing 1 star now instead of 4. And then I'm also rewriting this from println to print, right? Because I don't want it to print a new line after each star, right? I want all the stars to be in the same line. And then once I'm done, I'll put in my return character, right, to go to the next line. So let's compile this, run it, and hopefully get something that looks like a triangle. And there we go. This is a triangle. And this looks a little bit better than the one we did with while loops. This one is actually 10 high as well as 10 wide. And you can see here, right, starting with 1 star, 2 star, 3 star, 4 star, 5 star, and so on. And if we want to, right, we can make the star bigger. So let's say we instead change this to be, let's go for 16. So 16 for max rows, run this, and we get out a much larger triangle. One final note on the for loops, there is actually another form of for loop that looks something like this. For int I in many numbers, do something. Maybe it'll be a little bit longer, look maybe a little more like this. This is a different type of for loop. Most people will call this a for each loop. And the syntax here is a little bit different. Here, right, in what we had written in the past, there were 3 parts, right? We created a variable, we had its condition, then we had how it changed. The other form of a for loop is designed for if you have a collection of things that you're looping over. So for example, you have an iterator that contains a bunch of different items. What you can do is you can write a for loop that goes to that iterator and pulls out each thing one at a time. So over here, this many numbers thing, right, this name I've just made up here, would really be, in practice, the name of a variable containing an object that is an iterator. And then in I, that would represent an object being, or an item being taken out of that object. So that object presumably would contain a bunch of numbers. If it instead contained a bunch of strings, this would look more like string I. This just allows us to pull out a bunch of items from a collection or from an iterator, right, and look at each of them. So here, right, inside of this, we have now available I, right? So I would now be available here, and I is just something from that iterator, and we could do whatever we want. We could print it, we could add it, whatever we want. We're not really going to focus on this right now. Once we have kind of more time in Java, once we actually learn how to implement iterators ourselves, that's when we'll look at this different form of for loop and see how it can help us out.